focused on specific individuals who were perceived as being responsible for injustices, such as grain collection, people who had abused human rights and were abusive in their roles as police officers. So in Yeongchon, the county magistrate struck his house and killed. But as well in Yeongchon and in other rural areas, local kinship networks played an important role, and there were even factional rivalries within the same clan, and those ultimately exploded. So some landlords took their villages and participated, and other times it was actually tenants. It was a very broad coalition, so farmers, students, laborers, many people. Next slide. Today, there's obviously debate about what do you call the events of October. Was it a riot or was it an uprising? For a long time, it was considered a riot, but now uprising is considered to be more appropriate. Uprising means collective action, purposeful resistance against perceived injustice, even if there is violence involved. So that's why today many Korean historians call it Daegu-Gyeongbuk. They don't use political. However, the right, historians and commentators have tried to reframe the events once again. It's a riot, it criminalized the movement and erased its political opportunities. Their actions were the narrative that downplays violence and resistance rather than portraying the events as threats against national security and infiltration of outside. This is a photo from the U.S. National Archives where you can see police responding to the events in Daegu and the other side of the street here. In 2009, when it completed its investigation, the commission found that there were 59 victims of unlawful state violence related to state uprising. However, their investigation at the time was partial. It was geographically limited, and it relied on claims being made by descendants of victims many decades after the occurred. So we have to assume there were many more victims that are officially recognized. Argument is often made that some of the participants of the uprising deserved their fates. They used violence. However, even if some participants used violence, extrajudicial killings, and the denial of due process by state forces is seen to be the law. The perpetrators here were the police units, far-right auxiliary groups, such as the Northwest Youth League, and as well as police reinforcements and military reinforcements from other provinces, specifically Chungcheon. As well, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recognized U.S. culpability in this incident because at the time, U.S. military was in charge of military and had also declared law. So the U.S. was seen as sharing responsibility for violence and for failing to restrain killings. That's part of the reason why this event is hard to talk about today because of the ongoing bilateral relationship between some states. After the events of October, the Workers' Party of Korea was founded. And that was a merger of three leftist parties. And this proceeded despite criticism that the Communist Party of Korea faced from 9 other leftist parties over its failure to restrain the uprising or to control. And of course, there was the US-backed security crackdown that fragmented the leadership. Many who participated in the uprising either went into the mountains, Banchisan, some went north, and others simply went into hiding, afraid of what their fates might be. However, so armed resistance wasn't possible against Daegu-Gyeongbuk, but it did arise elsewhere in Korea. Of course, there was the Jeju April 3 events, as well as the Suncheon uprising. So we get to 1948, South Korea is officially established, and the government determines that it has to crack down on what they call unrest, without much consideration as to individual involvement. So they passed the National Security Act, and the prison system swelled. Prison capacity at this.
I just want to ask, what is,
I'll cover it. This is Jeju.
I know,
And
but what
this
is
is indicating that's fatality. So in order for red, there's four fatalities. Second and third videos. So the prison capacity in Korea at this time is 15,000. However, they have 40,000 people. So Daegu specifically had just under 2,000 in May 1948, but by August 1949, over 4,000. So the state determined they had to do something other than putting people into prison. How do you make use of these people? So there was an organization called Daegu-Gyeongbuk, the National Guidance, and this was created in Seoul without any formal legal basis, but there was consent from the ministers of the Interior, Justice, and National Defense. And the individuals involved with establishing this organization came from the prosecution. They had worked with the prosecution under the Japanese, as well as the military and police. The photo here is someone named Oh Jae-do. He was a prosecutor, and he eventually went on to serve in the National Assembly. And it was really him who conceived of the National Guidance. And the basis of this, the inspiration, came from similar organizations under the Japanese, Massacres, and these were organizations that the Japanese had established to suppress thought. So the National Guidance Aid was presented as a re-education program for those who defected from the left, and it emphasized that these people could go through education, they could reject violence, and then they could be reintegrated into South Korean society as proper subjects. And the intention was also that these converted individuals would be bullets who could be used to attack on the South Korean workers' party. The organization was considered to be voluntary, but in practice, it wasn't really voluntary. If you didn't join it, you may not be given a national ID, purchase train tickets, move around freely. So enrollment was often coerced. And oftentimes the members were pressured by people like village heads to enroll, because village heads were quotas to fill. So the membership of the Daegu-Gyeongbuk was very diverse. Of course, it included people who were active politically and had leftist sympathies, but it also included people who were promised things like, if you join, you can get employment. You may be given more rations. If you don't join, your family will be targeted by something. And there was an internal classification system as well. Members were either A, B, or C grade. A grade were people who had recruited members after joining, and also had given up names of people they had supposedly inspired. So Daegu-Gyeongbuk started in Seoul, but then it went out to the provinces. Daegu was the first place where a regional branch was established. So Daegu, there was a branch. At Gyeongbuk, on provincial level, there was a branch. Then in surrounding townships like Gyeongsan, branches were established as well. In Seoul, right before the Korean War, there was actually a membership review process that was undertaken, because the leaders of the Daegu-Gyeongbuk government said, we have way too many people in this organization, and not all of them should be here. So actually, 20 days before the Korean War broke out, there was a graduation ceremony in Seoul, and members were released from the Daegu. However, no graduation deliberations or review process took place south of Suwon. And that's why many of the membership of the Bodo government were subject to civilian massacres after that open war. So on June 25th, 1950, the Korean War, the North Korean invasion happened. The government fled south, and the Namdong River in the Daegu-Gyeongbuk region front line. The counterintelligence corps moved their headquarters to Daegu under martial law. And at this point, CFC and the police led preemptive arrests. The preemptive arrests targeted members of the National Guidance League, as well as people who were under surveillance. And the fear of the state was that a fifth column would emerge and would support the People's Army. And there were many major battles in the Daegu region, Daegu-Gyeongbuk to Chilga, Shinyang to Yongchon. So the North Koreans did advance towards peace. But as this advance was taking place, the police, military police, the CLC, supported by right-wing auxiliary groups, started perpetrating massacres. In Gyeongbuk and in Daegu, there was no review process before the massacres took place. In Gyeongnam and Busan, which were further away from the front lines, there was some review process before killings. So there, it was an A, B, C grade system. A's were killed first. As troops retreated, then the lower grades would be killed as well. So it's hard to say what went on behind closed doors, because documents have not been released, but we know there were directives issued from the Interior Ministry and the National Police. But it ultimately it's responsible as the commander-in-chief throughout this period. In Daegu-Gyeongbuk, we don't have photographs of the massacres. In regions like Daejeon and the surrounding areas of Chungcheon, we do have photographs. That's because U.S. military photographers were present and took photographs. So this is a photo of prisoners, likely from Gwangju prison, being taken to be massacred. So besides simply National Guidance League members, they also mandated prisons of political prisoners. Daejeon, Daegu, Cheongju, Gwangju. Yeah.
Like they seem to have both shaded down there.
Likely because these were prisoners, so had been in prison. That's part of their standard procedure.
I think he's asking about the bald spots. But
yeah, I'm not sure about that, but it's a good question. So, as I said, the prisons were empty. Photo League members, however, were taken to alternative spaces, makeshift warehouses, police stations, and then they were transferred from there to be killed. Not everyone who was taken for preemptive arrest was massacred. That's because some police officers accepted bribes and released people. If you were later on in the kill chain, you might have escaped. But it was, and also I should add that people who were more connected to leftist networks were in a better position to evade preemptive arrest. They had perhaps more foresight into the massacres that were taking place, and they might have taken the initiative to flee. But also many press union members complied with arrests because they were not told that this was an arrest. You might be told, okay, we're here coming for education or to participate in a work project like road construction. So many went, not necessarily knowing they waited. And this is just a photo of Daegu prison, which is no longer. There's a very small memorial to Daegu prison. However, any post-1945 history is not covered and focuses exclusively on the Korean liberation period. What I'm surprised. So in Daegu and in the surrounding areas, there were many different massacre sites. We know about some of those today, specifically part of the Gachang Dam, which is now submerged beneath water. There was a former tungsten ore mine in Sangwon and near Dongwachong. But some of the massacre sites at this point, the terrain has changed so much from redevelopment that the remains that were once there, were left there, are now lost or uncovered. Mass killings were widespread across Gyeongbuk. Nationwide, the League membership was estimated at the outbreak of war to be 300,000 people. Depending on your estimate, these 30 to 70% of members were killed, and there were many unregistered victims. And now, although the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is accepting cases to investigate, we're only getting a fraction. Now that we're, 7 years. But the Truth and Reconciliation has consistently recognized officially in its report that these killings were systematic, state-directed, violated due process, as well as national human. And I think it's just important to recognize, well, we can accept that North Korea did invade the South backed by Soviets. It must be stressed again that not all South Korean leftists supported Pyongyang. Their aims, not all of them engaged in hostilities. They were unfairly subjected to violence and massacre. And it's hard, I know we're many years, we were not personally there to witness it, but it highlights once again the challenge of protecting foreign democracy in security conflict. And today we have a responsibility for unjust repression must be acknowledged. But when the victims were killed, that wasn't the end of the story. Their families suffered, and that's because of the guilt by association system. I'll come back to this, but right now, I want to acknowledge the wives of many of the victims suffered economic hardship. That's the main breadwinner of the surviving parent faced emotional trauma. This often strained the relationship with their children. Some women remarried, and at that point, they didn't take their children with them. They would send them to live with relatives. And in those cases, the children might not be seen as equals, relatives' own children. And if there was no relatives, then they ended up in orphanage. So children also endured bullying at school, targeted with names like Daegu or Red. They face barriers in education. They may have to step up and work to provide for their siblings and their family, where the family didn't have money to send them to school. Daughters often couldn't get married due to the stigma from a potential partner's family. They were subjected to constant surveillance, repeated background checks, and they were also prevented from travel. So many bereaved family members who I met, some did manage to get passports under the table and go abroad, but others, one who worked as a nursing assistant when Koreans were being sent to West Germany, she was the only one cohort who was denied a passport. So bereaved families remain divided on many ways of seeking justice. And although they demand the truth of what happened to their loved ones, they are also demanding justice for themselves and the hardships that they have faced under the Yontaje system. So now I'm going to fast forward to April 1960. When we know that the April Revolution, or 19, started in Daegu with the 228. That was student protests against political interference in education. And after Daegu, then unrest rippled and spread down to South Gyeongsang province to Masa. There was the 315 uprising. And this was in response to electoral fraud the 1960 election under the Lee-Sung-man regime. So these two preceding events, coupled then with 419 Seoul, they toppled Lee-Sung-man, went into exile and war. But it wasn't immediately after 419 that organized activity by bereaved families started. And the activity that I'm going to talk about was very much focused in parts of Gyeongbuk, specifically Central Eastern Gyeongnam, so the Changwon, Masan, Gyeonghae area, and then in southern Gyeongbuk, Gyeongsan, Daegu-Gyeongbuk, as well as to the west of Seongju, Seongsan. And one of the reasons for this that we didn't see bereaved family activity elsewhere is because in Chungcheon, in Jeonnam, and in the western parts of Gyeongnam, that's where the People's Army had been. So bereaved families there feared that even if they were voices, the occupation by the People's Army they had committed would cause them to be retaliated against. So one event that catalyzed activities by families after April 1960 was an incident in Gocheon where the township chief was assassinated by villagers and bereaved families. And they held this particular township chief responsible for labeling victims of the Gocheon massacre communists. The Gocheon massacre is different from what happened with the four young men, Gyeongsan Cobalt Mine. It actually has more similarity with the massacres that took place at Gyeongju. I'm going to talk. But in Gocheon, 719 unarmed civilians, including 385 children, were massacred. And this Gocheon massacre was the only massacre that Lee-Sung-man acknowledged. And that's because in 1951, there was actually an inquiry in the trial. Some of the people responsible were sentenced to prison, but they were very quickly released. So it was unfulfilled justice in many respects. So after the assassination of this township chief, the press really started to talk about the massacre. Regional press, Busan-Ilbo, the Yongan-Ilbo ran many articles. And as well, the National Assembly felt that it had to take some action, at least at a cosmetic level. But the National Assembly, in both the major parties, the Liberal Party, the Democratic Party of China, there were members who had police and military backgrounds, and some of the members had themselves been involved in massacres, personally carrying out, and we'll talk about it. So the Fourth National Assembly conducted an investigation in the Gyeongnam and Gyeongbuk regions, as well as the Jeju. But this was very geographically limited, and it was very cautious, the recommendations that were made. Essentially, the National Assembly in Gyeongbuk it only focused on Gachangyeon, Daegu, and Mungyeon. The rest of the massacres were not involved. And when they made their report to the assembly, they basically just punted off responsibility for follow-up to the president. That was never done. This is a memorial stone that's still in Gocheon, and this was erected by bereaved families in 1960. Eventually, after 560, it's toppled, but this is one of the original monuments from that time that still is there today. It's in this toppled state. So after the incidents I just talked about, gradually bereaved family formal associations started to be established, and these were scattered around Gyeongsan, Daegu, Gyeongsan, and Seongju. And they got more aware that they needed to form some sort of collective action as they responded to inquiries by the National Assembly. But each one kind of had a different origin story. In the beginning, Yongnam activism was large scale and was coordinated. Bereaved families actually at times working with local administrations to respond to their grievances. In Gyeongbuk, though, early activism was much more cautious. It was focused on conducting memorial services, on gathering testimony, as well as uncovering remains at massacre sites. During the East Land regime, bereaved families could not go and recover the remains of their loved ones. So ultimately, the Gyeongbuk Association did sustain local bereaved family activity. And it played a very important role in forming a national organization. Bereaved families are different teachers union, labor organizations after 1960. Were very much top down, driven from Solid national to a much more grassroots. So in Gyeongsang, and I'm going to talk about the Gyeongsang Cobalt Mine Massacre, grass, but there the Bereaved Families Association's origins start and Kangchang-dong. Okay, since a young age, he had been somewhat rebellious, had resisted inscription, royal baby, or joined left-wing youth political groups, post-liberation, and he actually worked as almost an assistant to So San-il. He was a National Assembly member representing Yongsan in the Constituent Assembly, went on to become the leader of the Socialist Masses Party in 1960. And Kang had been arrested multiple times for his political activity. He was arrested, and I will add that in 1952 election, Lee Sung-man personally campaigned against Sosan and Daegu. He lost that election because his campaign team was rounded up and locked into an annex building days before the election. So they were not able to mobilize their voters. It was a very, very slim election. So if that had not happened, Mr. So would have been sample. In both Kang and So, they were involved with the election in football. They were very much involved in progressive socialist political. But in 1960, Kang was working for Daegu-Gyeongbuk, a local newspaper, and this paper was much more progressive. He had worked with the Yongnam Ilbo before. During the Lee regime, the paper had prevented him from publishing articles critical. So he went to the Daegu, covered the 419, covered 315 in Masan, and then he got an order in May from his editor to go to Cheongsan-dong in Gyeongsang and to look into rumors about a massacre that had occurred, where civilians were shot and pushed into an abandoned colonial era cobalt mine. So Kang shows up in a jeep in this village, and he tries to speak to the villagers there. Nobody wants to talk. They just point. There's the mine up there, you can go look for yourself. Of course, the locals had, on their own, they went to the mine, they scoured the remains. They scoured bones, gold teeth, other valuables. At the time, bones were seen as curing things like leprosy, so they would grind them up to resell or for medicinal purposes. This happened at massacre sites throughout the country. But when he was exploring on his own, he ended up meeting a man. He recalls he was in his 40s or his 50s. He's wearing clothes that looked like the uniform of a miner. And this man explained to him the story. In 1950, I saw the trucks coming. People had their heads down at gunpoint, then they were massacred at the site. So he went back to the paper and he wrote an article. And that article was published on the front page. But he then resigned from the newspaper because he said, this is my hometown. I cannot allow this injustice to go unresolved. So he took the initiative to rent a jeep. He printed thousands of leaflets, went around with a loudspeaker calling. Do you know anything about the massacre? Did you have a family member who was lost? And so he ultimately got 350 people to report their cases. But of course, many stayed silent because they continued to fear repression, distrusted that it was okay to raise their voice. So Khan and two of his colleagues, ultimately, they formed the Gyeongsang Bereaved Families Association, and they went on to serve as advisors, even as they engaged in other political activity as elections were held in and they organized a memorial ceremony at the biggest school in Gyeongsang. They had it before August 15th. At that point, China had still not been inaugurated, still an active leader at the national level. So they wanted to get ahead of what would become after this year. Government. They managed to drive 400 to 500. At this time, 400 to 500 people's place. And as they were preparing to hold their ceremony, the local police were sent. And the police were about to enter. It was because they were told to come and keep the peace. Kind of intervened. He said, if you show your faces here, the bereaved families, we don't know what they will do. So ultimately, he said, please go stand on the other side of the school. So they stood there while the memorial ceremony was held, not avoided any sort of confrontation. So it was able to go out without action. Now in Gyeongsang, the origins of the Bereaved Families Association there is quite different. This also has to do with the natures of the killings in Gyeongsang. So Mr. Kim Ha-jung, his extended family was massacred by the Minbodan and Lee Hyung-woo. Lee Hyung-woo was, at the time, from 1950, he was a member of the National Assembly. He had been elected with 16% of the vote, a very crowded field, but Gyeongju, specifically at this time, it was his fiefdom or his kingdom, held significant power. And the massacre of Kim's family was not the only massacre that was committed by Ian. They're estimated to have killed somewhat over 200 people. And many of these killings were driven by personal grievances and grudges. So in this case, the Kim family had responded to somebody stealing rice, who was a member of the Boda amongst these families. So that was their motivation. So, and the often his image is that they often killed entire families because they feared future revenge. So they could kill the children. Obviously, and Kim Ha-jung's father was not amongst the 30 who were massacred initially. His father was killed because he went and tried to recover the bodies and kill the funeral. So he had a very difficult childhood, but he worked very hard. And relatives ultimately got the money to send him to Seoul to pursue his education. He went to Seoul National University Law School. Because of his circumstances, he couldn't take the bar exam, but he ended up getting a job in Ministry of Justice, and he worked in the Corrections Bureau. He was responsible for oversight of applicants. After 419, his twin brother Kim Ha-tae convinced him to resign from his post, come back to the hometown, and finally avenge in a way killings of their family. So Kim went and filed criminal charges with the Daegu district prosecutor against his accomplices. And initially the prosecutors were very hostile to them, didn't take them seriously, said, how can you accuse this powerful figure? But they ultimately did their job, thoroughly investigated it. And while this was a good thing, it wasn't enough because of these influence. 1957, another victim named Yoon was in the Marines, had filed a criminal case as well against Lee, but that he faced so much intimidation that he withdrew. And as Kim had filed his case, he was threatened, he was offered money to leave town, he was pressured to leave the country, but he resisted all. He was also told you should take gentlemanly revenge against Lee and run against him in the election. But he was determined to see the case through. Unfortunately, although the court convicted Lee on a slew of charges, he was acquitted in a retrial after 2016. He ended up serving less than 1,000 days in prison. And when he was released, he sued the government and claimed compensation for the time he had spent in jail. He actually had bankrupted himself because he spent so much money during his trial trying to flip lawyers who bereaved families had hired as into violent witnesses. So suffice it to say, Kim and the bereaved families that resisted the pressure to drop the charges. Ultimately, 860 families filed charges against him. And so, apart from that, Kim was convinced to become the chairman of a bereaved families association. At the time, he was only 27 years old. He didn't have money. He didn't plan on becoming the head of this organization. But there was a wealthy family who had fled Gyeongbuk. They went to Busan to escape Lee-Ho-Woo's tyranny. They opened a brewery. So they said, if you become the chairman, we will support you. We will give you the money that we have raised. We'll get you a Jeep. You can take this Jeep and go out to all the remote villages and collect testimony. And one of our family members, man in his late 50s, would serve as the vice chair. So they did that. They established their bereaved families association. And despite their office, the police had planted a stooge in there. The person receiving all the testimony was actually reporting everything. But in any event, in November, they managed to drop 2,500 to 4,000 attendees. The lower number is what the police officially reported. 4,000 is what some witnesses recall. But this is much, much larger than modern day memorial service. And they actually had attended petitions, 3 members of the National Assembly that had been elected since the election, as well as prosecutors, legal groups, and religious organizations, so Buddhist organizations. And there was quite an interesting figure who attended their forum, and that was Jo Lee-Boon. So Jo Lee-Boon was the sister-in-law of Park Chung-hee. And so Park Chung-hee's older brother, Sang-hee, was actually killed during the October Uprising in what is now Gu. So she was actually the head of the women's department, Somsan Bereaved Families Association. And there was a person who was called, another person who was very important in attendance was Lee Won-sik. Now, Lee Won-sik attended both the Gyeongsan and the Gyeongbuk Association. He would go on to head the Gyeongbuk Bereaved Families Association, he was really the organizer, working behind the scenes both in his own organization and at. And he belonged to the colonial era teacher intellectual class. He was involved in anti-Japanese societies. He was involved in the dissident Esperanto movement. He wrote many books on science and cultural preservation. He tried to bring stolen artifacts back to Japan. He had been arrested, sent to prison 5 times in Japan. And then after liberation, he ended up being sent to prison 5 more times. So he was involved in left-right cooperation, a whole laundry list of organizations. And he also had, he was a medical doctor and an herbal medicine doctor. He had a clinic called the Yeongchon Clinic, and he treated independence fighters, in this obviously. So right from 1945, he was under surveillance by and he was also a member of the Bodo League himself, but he went into hiding. When he went into hiding, the authorities came looking for him. They ended up taking his wife instead. So his wife was a victim of the civilian massacres. And it was his determination, and he felt responsible for her killing. And that's what really motivated him to establish it. He felt that not only his own families, but all bereaved families should have the opportunity for loved ones and to seek redress. So this is Yvonne Shin, this is his wife, He. So from the beginning, Gyeongbuk, they were walking a tightrope. Because as they were starting to get organized and they were trying to establish their organizations, elections were underway. And Socialist Mass Party wanted to capitalize on their organization of bereaved families and get their votes. And he was, very worried about being aligned with any specific political party. Although he was to the left, it was progressive. He wanted to stay neutral. And the chairman was appointed, wanted to align themselves with the Socialist Mass Party. Shin recognized they were sympathetic to their cause, they should work together. So despite the shaky start and internal tensions, they went ahead, they founded their association, and at their foundation meeting, which was at the Daegu-Gyeongbuk of Commerce, a representative of the prosecutor's office came and said, if this organization is going to be honoring members of the Communist Party, it has no way to establish itself and it must be suppressed. It's caused then confrontation between him and the group families. They ultimately have to delay the appointment of executives. But this confrontation really indicated to them that they had to hold their messaging. They had to strengthen the language they used to describe the victims of the massacre. They had to show that these people were not undeserved communists, but that they were patriots, intellectuals, and they were resistors of an anti-national regime. And doing this was necessary to claim justice as well. So outside of Daegu Station, July 28th, right a day before the National Assembly election, they had 2,000 people there with the word. And this memorial was presided over by Sheikh. The crowd condemned executions. They demanded justice from the police, military officials. They wanted them to be held responsible. They also demanded an end to surveillance of families. So they created banners saying punish those in execution, stop police surveillance, and return our ancestral registers. So there were many complications of family registers after the massacres, whereas many of the people massacred, there was no records to prove their deaths, so they remained on the family register. Following this, he was on the forefront of efforts to recover remains that had been scattered. So they led expeditions to these different sites. The bereaved families themselves took shovels, took pickaxes, and recovered the bodies. Because of 516, they were never able to enshrine those remains. So they were ultimately left on the spot. And here you can see a photo of the Daegu-Gyeongbuk bereaved families association. These are bereaved families at one of the massacres that's weeping over. And this is a photo again of some of the things that oftentimes you find things like rubber shoes, seals, hairpins. These were all left at different sites around. So he not only played a role in his own town, but he showed solidarity with those elsewhere in the province. He personally wrote the messaging on the banners and the leaflets. He distributed these to Gyeongju and to Gyeongsang. And when the trial with Lee Hyung-woo was happening, he used the Daegu-Gyeongbuk, which was the publication of their association, to encourage bereaved families to pay very close attention to the trial. And as the trial was happening in Gyeongju, there was an incident where the Bereaved Families Associations of wounded veterans, the military and police families ransacked the office of the Gyeongju family. So to respond to that, the Gyeongbuk Association went to Gyeongju and presented themselves, said this has to stop. They made formal protests with the authorities there. Ultimately, it was in October 1960 that the National Association of Bereaved Families was established. And it was 50 representatives, mainly from North Gyeongsang and South. And their foundation meeting was held in quite an interesting location. It was held in the headquarters of the Liberal Party. So that was Lee Suk-man's political party. So they held their foundation meeting there. And ultimately, the National Association played a bit of a different role than local. It focused much more on petitioning, on meeting prominent figures and lobbying. And although Lee Shik was really responsible for getting it started, it was two people from Gyeongnam who took the official leadership. And that was Roh Young-suk. His son, Do Chi-soo, is now the head of the Bereaved Families Association in Massacres currently. And the vice chair was a woman named Kathleen, whose husband. And Noah was actually more right wing and had been involved in labor unions. So the composition of the National Association is also fairly politically diverse. One of the members had actually been in the military, had been involved in suppressing guerrilla activities in Jerry's. So again, not monolithic. As all of this was happening, the government of Changnyeong took office. And Changnyeong government was not very popular. It was criticized for the slow pace of reforms, and the Democratic Party was not much more progressive compared to the Liberal Party. So there were many demonstrations happening against it by labor unions, by leftist political groups, bereaved families. And in response to all of these demonstrations, the Changnyeong government was trying to demonstrate its commitment to anti-communism, to gain the trust of the US government. It ultimately proposed two laws, the anti-communist special law and a law for suppressing demonstration. These came to be known as the two evil laws. So they were meant to control dissent, counter communist threats, and manage economic instability. So many supporters of the April Revolution felt betrayed by the Changnyeong government. And there were demonstrations held in Seoul and in other cities, Daegu, against these laws. And the Gyeongbuk Bereaved Families Association participated directly in the rally that was held on June 1st. Not only did they carry placards, but they also donated to the organizing fund. So as I had said, Lee Won-shik had opposed aligning with a specific political, but out of a commitment to uncovering the truth, protecting the mission of the association on politics, he said it was necessary to be involved in these demonstrations. So the photos here are of demonstrations that was sold against the two equal laws in favor. This is the current Seoul public library at City Hall. Ultimately, the Changmyeong government withdrew the evil laws, but again, its administration was on very shaky foundation. And on May 16th, 1961, a coup d'etat was led by military and option in the forefront. Now, U.S. Commander Bruder and the acting ambassador Marshall Green, they publicly supported Changmyeong's government and they condemned the coup. But the broader U.S. government did not want to explicitly intervene and stop the coup, so they did not act with it. And Changmyeong didn't resist either. He actually went into hiding as the coup was for several days thereafter. He did not, even though his defense minister was under house arrest. And so the government itself opposed mobilizing troops to stop the coup. The White House, the U.S. government, they were aware of Park Chung-hee's political background. He had been, allied with communist activity, Suncheon uprising, but they ultimately determined that he was okay. He had proven his commitment to anti-communism by giving up the names of people associated with, so they trusted him. But Park Chung-hee also determined that he had to continue showing trust to the U.S. government. So he felt it was necessary in this vein to suppress progressive groups, labor organizations, as well as the families associations. They were targeted as, and the U.S. Embassy in Seoul actually took a position as that this new government has to respect human rights. Koreans had tasted democracy after April 1960, and it wouldn't be a good situation if this military government were to completely ignore them. But crackdowns began almost immediately after this coup. Nearly 1,000 subversives were rounded up nationwide as being anti-revolutionary or pro-communist. The new regime actually planned arbitrary mass arrests. They used an automatic arrest list that had been prepared in the case of a North Korean invasion scenario. As I said, the U.S. tried to restrain the new military government, but it did not succeed. Bereaved families kind of came in the second wave of the dragon that the new Supreme Council for National Reconstruction carried out. Lee Won-shin was arrested in June 1961. Bin Ha-jong was arrested after he came out of the military in August. By then, the Revolutionary Tribunal, had been established. And from the start, Revolutionary Tribunal very much focused on people associated with election fraud, hooligan bosses, gang bosses, Seoul, and the Minjong Hill. Those were some of the most important cases dealt with. But so its broad goal was to eliminate political opposition and to gain public trust, showing that it was able to control society, to bring order and stability, chaos, which it said the Changmyeong government was responsible. So these two photos here, these are those who were sentenced to the Minjong-il case. But then it came time to try the bereaved family. And the authorities accused the bereaved family members of impersonating patriots, of exploiting the deaths of left, sowing confusion and acting as orderly agents. Shin Seok-kyun, who was officially the chairman of the Gyeongbuk Bereaved Families Association, died in custody at Daegu prison after he was arrested. He had a heart attack caused by pulmonary infiltration. He also suffered from nutrition. And although his body was claimed by his families, in the trial proceedings, prosecutors argued that he had defected to North Korea and had crossed the 30th parallel. So fortunately, the Korea University Library has all of the trial records or things that were prepared by the revolutionary period. That's where I was able to get forward. So in these trial meetings, all of the bereaved families decree was seen as a dangerous form of political resistance. Their ability to mobilize public support and was threatened, as well as their recovery of proofs and crimes. So in each of the cases, the bereaved family struggle was as much about asserting identity and dignity as it was about recovering law. But of the 29 indicted members of the Bereaved Families Association, not all of them were sentenced. Revolutionary Tribunal zeroed in on those who in interrogations were repentant and for those with more problematic backgrounds. So the sentencing of the court, even though all the charges were the same, was very inconsistent. This was meant to appear fair and to avoid that. Lee Won-shik was the only one who was sentenced to death for his activities in organizing the October Families Association. After 10 years, he was released, and that was due to the intervention of Jo Hui-bun, sister-in-law of Park Chung-hee, who I had spoken about. Lee Won-shik had gone to the same school as Park Chung-hee, and his lawyer did as well, so there was a personal connection. However, he was rearrested in 1975, and then he passed away in 1978. Kim Ha-jong, he received a 7-year sentence for his activities in organizing the Families Association and for the case he brought against Daegu. He was eventually pardoned, and now he is currently, as I had said, serving as the chairman of the Gyeongbuk Bereaved Families Association, and he took that role on during the Second Truth and Reconciliation. Finally, Kang Chak-dok, the journalist who I talked about in the Gyeongsan case, he was not tried amongst the bereaved families, but he was tried in a separate case by the Revolutionary Tribunal over his activity in socialist massacre. And he would eventually go on to be implicated in the People's Revolutionary Party reconstruction case in 1975, for which 8 people were executed, all of them from Daegu. So the Revolutionary Tribunal's suppression of bereaved families completely halted their activity across Korea. And it wasn't until the 1990s that truth-seeking and public commemorations for state massacre victims could reemerge in public life. That's because in 1972, the Yushin Constitution was promulgated. Park Chung-hee granted himself broad powers. And then after his assassination, Won seized power. So families were operating under conditions of hostile surveillance of the Indian. And as I have spoken about, there was the guild by association system. At various times, government claimed that this system would be abolished. In 1966, it was said that they were going to abolish this. It was never abolished. Then again, in 1980, when the new constitution was being promoted, there was actually promotional items like this that were distributed, saying we are going to end the guild by association. But even then, it wasn't officially repealed. It was really, bereaved families felt they were under the system until and that prevented many of them. So I talked about the conditions which bereaved families endured, exclusion from employment, surveillance, stigma in their communities. This all discouraged them. Even after democratization, some government was elected. That government was reliant on conservative groups in the National Assembly. So they were not in a position to reopen certain issues. Only under Kim Dae-jung could truth seeking truly come back to the forefront. And so Kim Dae-jung's administration opens political space to discuss state violence. There were national level investigations for the first time since those conducted by the Fourth National Assembly. There was a special law for the victims of Jeju 43 in 2000, as well as the special act to find the truth of suspicious deaths. Suspicious Deaths Commission had 2 terms that ended its mandate in 2000. So although these 2 commissions did not address Korean War mass killings, they lowered the barriers for public discussion of state violence. Really, the decisive push came from a freer press. So in 1999, the Associated Press wrote the story of how the U.S. 7th Cavalry troops executed civilians under a rail bridge in Gyeongbuk. That's the Nogunri incident. Later that year in 2000, Lee Do-young, a professor from Jeju, uncovered photos from the U.S. National Archives of mass executions at Goryeo from the Daegu-Gyeongbuk prison. This photo is one of the victims, probably a political prisoner. Daegu was dragged out. He's looking at the U.S. military camera as he's executed. So the Nogunri report and the Daegu reports, they really helped shatter taboos around speaking about post-liberation state violence. And they elevated the issue in both international and domestic. In 2001, there was actually the Korea International War Crimes Tribunal that was held by civil society or with participation from legal professionals from all of the Korean War, all the countries that participated in this mock court, collecting witness testimonies in person, as well as on video for those who were denied visas by the United States. The tribunal found all the U.S. heads of government, secretaries of state, CIA heads, etc., guilty of war crimes, 19 different war crimes, 1945 present. Choi Sung-ho kind of inherited the struggle of Kang Chang-dong. He's the current publisher of the Gyeongsan Shinmun, a local newspaper in Gyeongsan, and he was writing a travel column in the 1990s, and he, like Kang, went to certain sites, some cobalt. So when after the Nogunri story broke, January 2000, he published on the front page a story about the Gyeongsan cobalt mine massacre, and this drew out 3 bereaved family members. Together, they started or revived the Association for Family. And he was also involved in the Local History Association, and from 1995, they had been quietly visiting the Gyeongsan cobalt mine site. Not any sort of organized Jessa, but bringing makgeolli, bringing food for the spirits, bowing and honoring victims. Political momentum for truth-seeking really got underway after Kim Dae-jung under Roh Moo-hyun's government. That's when the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Korea was established. Roh Moo-hyun gave an apology for the victim portrait. He also recorded a video message for National Guidance League victims. Roh's government was quite weak in the National Assembly. He faced impeachment, and that played into the limited scope of the first Truth and Reconciliation. How much ground did it cover? Nevertheless, that was the beginning of official truth. In the same year that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started, the Daegu October Bereaved Families Association also got away. they engaged in somewhat of progressive organizing, demonstrated against the use of Agent Orange by the U.S. military. They had solidarity with Goryeo. So they were very active. They invited peace delegations from Japan. And this is Chae Yong-hee. She's daughter of one of the participants. The Daegu Uprising has suffered significantly in many ways under the licensing system. Can't go into this right now, but she's been a very helpful interviewee subject. So both Gyeongsan and Daegu, they've now lobbied for the construction of cenotaphs to collect funds for their memorial services. They've organized bereaved families, supported them in submitting petitions to the Truth and Rights. Now they're involved in things like trauma healing. She's received compensation money and has donated all of that money. So other victims come forward and try to involve. I'm almost done that. What I will say is that the bereaved family members are not a monolith. The Gyeongsan Association is now much more conservative than Daegu. They try to go through official channels. They're not, the way they are responding now is different. Skip over that. Currently, excavation efforts are underway in Gyeongsan once again after 16 years. They were halted under Lee-Myung-bak's government. There's a Korea Times article in which I talk about the resumption of these activities. They have a small budget. There are still many remains of gunpowder, but they are trying now to establish a boarding site and memorialize. These are just some photos of the conditions in which they are working. So that 3,500 were killed here. There are structural issues, very difficult to do excavation and on a limited budget. Efforts are much more difficult. Finally, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is now at the end of its second mandate. It completed its investigation period in May of this year, and it will release its final report in November. However, in the past year and a half, new right figures have been appointed to key positions within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The former chairman, Kim Kwang-dong, has said it is okay to execute people in wartime. Many cases submitted by bereaved families have been dismissed. The current chairwoman, Chung Sung-young, has made many inflammatory comments as well. So the National Assembly is calling for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to receive a third mandate, new phases under a completely different structure. We'll see how that goes. But there is much more to be done. In terms of individual petitions, excavation remains, and in terms of the politics of memory and how this history is remembered through school textbooks and our museums and in other aspects of life. So I didn't have time to go into everything, but I hope you learned something, and I'm happy to take questions after the lecture.
Thank you, Jack.